So, believe it or not, the Callisto Protocol was completely off my radar going into December. I saw its trailer only a few days before its release and figured, hey, I love survival horror as much as the next guy, and the Resident Evil 4 remake is still 3 months away, so why not give it a shot? Considering the AAA presentation and the overall lack of survival horror games recently, I was very excited for the Callisto Protocol. So, how is the game? Well, it's okay, I guess. Now, I want to be clear on something. If you've been following the Callisto Protocol on social media a few days after its release, you know the reviews at the moment are not exactly great. Now, do I think that this game is absolutely terrible? No. But do I think the Callisto Protocol is a great survival horror game that will be remembered for years to come? No, I don't exactly think that either. The Callisto Protocol had the setting and the theme for an amazing sci-fi horror experience, but unfortunately the game really struggles to create its own unique foundation to separate it from, well, that other sci-fi horror franchise. But I'm jumping ahead of myself, and I promise I'm going to try and refrain from Dead Space comparisons throughout the video. Now, first off, the Callisto Protocol does a lot of things very well, and I want to talk about that before we get to the more detailed segments. First of all, the game's graphics, lighting, and voice acting are all AAA. This game looks absolutely fantastic in both cutscene and in gameplay. I've seen people online complain about optimization issues, but honestly I didn't have much issue. Frame rates ran at a consistent FPS and bugs were rarely a problem. Now, obviously no game is bug-free. More specifically, near the end of the game, I experienced bugs like my subtitles disappearing, and early on I had a bug where dialogue was just straight up missing.
Those things killed them.
Are these bugs annoying? Absolutely, but it's nothing I would consider game-breaking. Now, very quickly, I want to give the story a quick summary, just so the basic plot is understood for people who haven't played. I'm basically going to talk about the first 15 minutes of the game. If you don't want the prologue spoiled, skip to this timestamp. Anyway, the game takes place 300 years in the future, and the player takes control of a cargo pilot named Jacob Lee. Jacob and his partner Max are delivering some cargo to the Black Iron Prison, which is on one of Jupiter's moons called Callisto. As they were just arriving, their ship gets unexpectedly boarded by a mysterious group of people. This group of people ends up trying to kill Jacob and Max, and after they attempt to do so, the ship ends up crashing on Callisto. Jacob awakens to find that his partner Max has been killed in the crash, and a few seconds after discovering his body, the side of the ship is cut open and a man walks in, introducing himself as Captain Ferris. Ferris discovers another survivor of the crash, a girl named Dani Nakamura, who was present on the ship earlier trying to kill Jacob. Ferris ends up taking Dani and Jacob to the Black Iron Prison, not for hospitalization, but as inmates. Very shortly after his arrival, Jacob awakens to the prison in complete chaos. Jacob later discovers some sort of outbreak has occurred at the prison, and it's infecting the staff workers and inmates, turning them into monsters. And with that, the story is basically summarized. Jacob must now find a way off Callisto while fighting off the mysterious creatures that have taken over the prison. Along the way, you discover more about Callisto's dark history and the mysterious motivations of the Black Iron Prison. From this point on, we will no longer be talking about spoilers. Now, the story in the Callisto Protocol is honestly not that bad. It's not fantastic either, but it's also not horrible. There are some good things about the story, more specifically the main protagonist. Jacob is, in my opinion, a serviceable protagonist. He comes off as a hard ass and a bit of a prick, but Jacob is later shown to be a genuinely caring person. And above all else, Jacob actually goes through a pretty solid character arc. Again, I won't go into spoilers, but I was honestly not expecting Jacob's story to take the turn that it did. So that's something in the story's favor. The problem lies in the other characters. The dialogue between characters is actually pretty good, and more importantly, there are some genuinely good and intriguing moments between these characters, specifically Elias and Dani. Jacob and Elias have some great scenes together. The problem is, while I liked Elias as a character, he's barely fleshed out. Interactions with Elias and Jacob early on in the game are usually very brief, and just when their dialogue begins to get very interesting, the game immediately jumps back to gameplay. A few more scenes of Elias and Jacob I think would have gone a long way. Now, Dani is a character I didn't have good impressions of early on. In the first half of the game, Dani is given almost nothing to do. However, the second half of the game is where she starts to develop some actual character. I can't say much about her character as a lot of it is spoiler related, but just know that Dani and Jacob do have some good scenes together. Unlike Elias, Dani and Jacob actually get a lot of scenes together, and their relationship is much more fleshed out. However, not all the characters here are great. One of the main villains is the prison warden named Cole, and I cannot take this guy seriously. Cole is just way too cartoony for me, especially once you learn what his end goal is. Finally, Max's character just feels incredibly misguided. He's not given much to do, and I would be fine with that if he was just a written off character, but he isn't. Max shows up throughout the game in the form of hallucinations, and every time he does, it just throws me off, because I barely know anything about the guy. It would have gone a long way if the prologue was stretched out just a little longer, give the player a little insight into Max's character, and flesh out he and Jacob's relationship a little more. While I think most of the characters are passable, the problem is in the writing. Again, I won't go into spoilers, but there are plenty of moments in the story that don't make any goddamn sense. The story struggles to find a place in the gameplay, with the closest thing being radio conversations between Jacob and either Elias or Dani. Honestly, the best word I can use to describe the plot is soulless, and that's because the game really struggles to have its own identity, and despite some of these characters being well written, it's not enough to save the story outright. Now, before we move on, there's one more character I want to talk about, and that's Captain Ferris. Ferris is easily the most textbook example of giant asshole for no reason I've seen in a very long time. I say that like it's a criticism, but I actually mean it as a positive. In fact, if I had to throw another criticism towards the story, it's that Captain Ferris does not get enough screen time. Sam Witwer does an absolutely fantastic job with what he's given. The scenes that have Captain Ferris in it are just so much fun, I can't help but love the guy.
Okay, let me see if I got this straight. You crash here, and then this whole place goes to shit. Oh, 5, 2, 1. Look at me when I'm talking to you. What'd you do? Huh? You can tell me. Are you different? Are you special?
So, overall, the story has flaws, but it's mostly passable. So, how's the gameplay? Okay, we've got a lot to talk about. To cut to the chase, the Callisto protocol made a lot of questionable decisions with its gameplay design. First of all, let's talk about the combat. The best thing I can say about the combat is the amount of weapons and gear the game gives you to handle threats. First, let's talk about the melee combat, since it's easily the most unique thing about Callisto's gameplay. The developers made a very interesting decision to melee combat by using the left stick as the dodge input. When an enemy attacks you, if you're holding the left stick to the left or right, Jacob will dodge out of the way. However, you cannot dodge in the same direction twice. You also have the option to block an opponent's attack. Okay, let's get this out of the way. The combat in the Callisto protocol certainly takes some getting used to. I don't remember the last time a game with an over-the-shoulder camera used the left stick as the dodge input. However, when you do get it down, the combat can actually be a lot of fun. Melee strikes are satisfying as hell, mostly because of how brutal your attacks are. Jacob's swings are so vicious and brutal in this game, and if you're landing your dodges, it makes the combat all the more satisfying. However, there is a problem with the dodges, and this is where we get to one of the game's biggest sins. You see, you can only dodge an enemy if you're facing their direction. It seems simple enough until you realize you cannot lock onto enemies. Meaning, if two different enemies attack you from two different directions, you're going to get hit. There is nothing you can do about it. This gets annoying rather fast, especially since the game throws enemies at you in bunches, meaning a vast majority of Callisto's combat segments have groups of enemies attacking you at the same time. Combat segments early on were very difficult. A lot of it was getting used to the dodging, but I do believe a huge reason for my early struggles was the lack of efficient crowd control. That's until you eventually find the GRP, and thankfully it's early on in the game. The GRP is the glove that can lift both objects and enemies and launch them wherever the player wants. Not only is the GRP just fun as hell to use, it's perfect for crowd controlling enemies when their numbers get too large. It should be mentioned that the environments sometimes have hazards like spike walls and rapidly spinning gears. The GRP can be used to launch enemies into these hazards, instantly killing them. The GRP is an incredibly useful tool, and because of that, it runs on batteries that run out after constant use. This brings us to the scavenging part of the gameplay. The Callisto Protocol is obviously a survival horror game, so it has elements of scavenging and inventory management. Surprisingly, the game is rather generous with how much supplies it gives the player, but it's balanced out by having limited inventory slots. Around the prison, you'll find mostly ammo, health injectors, Callisto credits, and valuables that can be sold for more Callisto credits. These Callisto credits can be used to upgrade your weapons as well as craft other weapons using schematics found throughout the levels. First of all, the game gives you plenty of upgrade options. Pretty much anything that deals damage in this game can be upgraded. These upgrades range from higher damage, higher ammo capacity, mostly basic upgrades, but for the security baton you can upgrade it to unlock a heavy attack and a sweep. And for the GRP you can upgrade its damage and battery capacity. It's not quite Doom Eternal levels of weapon upgrades, but it's still very well done. Now, there is something I wanted to point out before we proceed. The developers actually decided to throw in some stealth mechanics into the gameplay, and it's terrible. Not only does crouching around feel incredibly sluggish, but it turns out the Callisto Protocol went to the Rogue Warrior school of stealth, where I can very audibly kill an enemy a few feet away from another enemy and it somehow doesn't hear it. This becomes especially bad at about the halfway point of the game where you're introduced to these clicker-like enemies who are blind and can only find you through sound. You can imagine the immersion-breaking experience I've had when I audibly stop the corpse of a monster with another monster only a few feet away, and it has absolutely no reaction. Similar to that other survival horror franchise, you can blow off an enemy's limb if that specific limb takes enough damage. You want a tip to survive in the Callisto Protocol? Don't be fooled by going for the head. Go for the legs. It makes your job 10 times easier. Now, another thing I want to touch on briefly is the enemy mutations. As you're fighting an enemy, sometimes tentacles will burst out of their chest. This is a sign that they are in the process of mutating, becoming stronger and more resistant to damage. The player must shoot the tentacles before the mutation happens, or very quickly kill the enemy and stomp on its corpse to prevent any post-mortem mutations. This is a fine mechanic in theory, however there is one huge problem. The mutated enemies in this game are complete bullet sponges. Even with a shotgun, some of these enemies can take up to 4 to 5 point-blank shots before eventually dying. This becomes especially bad near the end of the game where mutated enemies are being thrown at you in waves. The gunplay in the Callisto Protocol is clunky as all hell. Aiming is rather difficult, especially in tense situations. Just like the melee combat, the gunplay takes a little getting used to. This segues perfectly into another issue with the Callisto Protocol, and that's the weapon switching. To be blunt, switching weapons in this game takes way too long, especially when fighting bosses or huge groups of enemies. Unlike other games that automatically switch weapons at the push of a button, in this game Jacob will slowly put his original weapon away as he very slowly grabs whatever weapon you selected. Oh, and if the gun you selected did not have any ammo, you must reload it after finally equipping it. The slow weapon switching plus the shockingly fast closing speed of the monsters means these combat segments can grow frustrating, especially early on when you're still getting used to the melee combat. Another huge problem that plagues this game is the enemy variety. In a game like the Callisto Protocol, you'd expect a huge roster of crazy enemies to fight. Instead, most of them just feel exactly the same, just slightly upgraded versions of the basic monster types. Not only that, but all these enemies are killed in the exact same way, instead of having all these enemies having specific attacks, strengths, and weaknesses. Again, let me bring up Doom Eternal. Not only does Doom Eternal have a huge roster of enemies, each enemy has a specific strength and weakness. Each enemy had their own unique approach to combat. They all required a different approach to take them down. The Callisto Protocol does not have either. Not only is it lacking in enemy variety, the variants we do have are all dealt with the same. Now, before you say it, yes, the blind enemies promote stealth, and the exploding enemies require you kill them from far away. That's about the extent of it. You'd think in a game that has so many different tools and weapons to approach a combat scenario to piggyback right on the Doom Eternal formula, but it doesn't. There was huge potential there, and the developers completely missed the mark. The weapon upgrades and drastic events in the story only delay the feeling of repetition for so long. The overall gameplay loop consists of a fight segment, followed by holding forward till you get to either another fight segment, a segment where you can scavenge for supplies, or a segment that leads to a cutscene. Also, this is a total left turn, but this is something else that really bothered me. This game has way too many goddamn crawling segments. The amount of vents Jacob crawls through in this game, I swear to God it takes up at least 20 minutes of playtime. Another thing that sucks in the Callisto Protocol is this two-headed monster boss that shows up from time to time. This boss is the textbook example of a bullet sponge. Don't let its damaged limbs fool you. This boss has literally no reaction to damage whatsoever. You just shoot it till it drops to its knees, then melee hit it 3 times just for it to rip one of its heads off and continue the process all over again. If it showed up once or twice, I could forgive it, but if I'm not mistaken, this boss shows up 4 times. It feels like a chore to fight this boss because he actually does crazy damage, so you have to pay attention. And my god, these fights are boring. Easily one of the worst boss fights I've experienced in a long time. Now, above all else, is the game scary? Even with all of its flaws, does it succeed at scaring the player? No, it doesn't. I honestly think this game's lack of scare factor has to do with how melee-focused the combat is. The player relies heavily on melee combat in this game. It's usually your go-to method for dealing with enemies, especially since their closing distance is so fast. With how vicious and violent Jacob's swings are, it feels more like a beat-em-up than a survival horror game. As stated, lack of supplies is rarely an issue. In fact, you'll be dealing with cluttered inventories more than you'll be desperately searching for ammo. Because of this, the player is almost never in a state of vulnerability, which means the player is not tense or scared. When it's not the gameplay trying to scare you, the game does throw a few jump scares at the player, and they're mostly bad. I think I was startled once, and more importantly, there's little setup to these jump scares. They just happen. The game fails to land any feelings of isolation or despair, and a lot of that is due to having an abundance of supplies and the game lacking a genuine atmosphere. If I had to think of a positive, it's the sheer amount of weapon upgrades as well as collectible items like audio logs that do add some replayability to the game. Upon completion of the game, I unlocked maybe 60 to 70% of all the weapon upgrades, so that's a checkmark in the game's favor. So, with all of that said, I think that about summarizes my thoughts on the Callisto Protocol. Now, I want to say a few things before we end the video. Like I said in the beginning of the video, the Callisto Protocol had all the tools it needed to be its own unique experience. Unfortunately, the game really struggled at building its own foundations, and the entire game struggled as a result. The Callisto Protocol does have a lot of things going for it. The game looks fantastic, the melee combat is certainly something new, and the settings and ideas they had for the story were not bad at all. However, the Callisto Protocol does not feel like the start of a fresh new survival horror franchise. It feels like a Dead Space-inspired third-person action-adventure game. On top of the game failing to establish the elements of survival horror and the story feeling like nothing but an afterthought, the Callisto Protocol feels like another lifeless installment into the survival horror genre. If you're absolutely starved for survival horror games and need something to play, pick up the Callisto Protocol when it's on sale. But as it stands right now, the game has simply too many drawbacks for me to recommend it. Is it a crushing disappointment? Of course it is. But survival horror fans, please rejoice. The Resident Evil 4 remake is only 3 months away. Capcom, please don't fuck this up.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient. Hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000.
Is it a crushing disappointment? Of course. But survival horror fans, please rejoice. The Resident Evil 3... I said Resident Evil 3 remake, wow. I actually typed that into the fucking script. Wow.